Hello everybody. Welcome to another processing video. It's amazing what a shave and a haircut will do. I actually look reasonably respectable today. Sometimes I clean up okay. What I'm going to be covering today is somewhat similar to my last video, dodging and burning again. The reason why I'm doing so much dodging and burning in my images, especially lately, is because the light has just been so flat. I haven't had any kind of directional light to give images their depth. Now, if you watched my last video, Buried in Snow, and if you haven't seen it, I'll leave a link up here. As I kept saying throughout the whole video, the light is really flat, and it was really flat. It just doesn't give the added depth that you need in your photographs to draw, the viewer's eye into it. Now there are some photographers that work with flat light very well. There's one that comes off the top of my head, and that's Theo Bosbom. And if you don't know of Theo, you should check out his website. I'll leave a link down below. He has, well, he's an amazing photographer, and a lot of his images he utilizes quite flat light with snow and a lot of white, and I just love his photography, so check him out. But in this video I'm going to be adding the illusion of depth and light by just some simple techniques, dodging, burning, and lightening certain areas to draw the viewer's eye into them. So without further delay, why don't we get right into processing this image. All right. Okay, this is the image that I'm going to process today. The brightest spots in this whole image are kind of up here. There's two bright spots here, another one here, and this is quite bright down here. But there's no contrast, and there's nothing really to lead you into the frame. Now, the first thing I usually do with any image is kind of define to myself, well, what is the main subject? What is it that I want to do with this photograph? With this particular image, my intention was to frame these two trees with these two larger trees, and that's what I've done. So the main subject for me is these two main trees in the center here. So how do I draw people's attention to those two trees? Well, we can work in tones. Generally speaking, brighter tones will attract more attention than, say, darker tones. So what I'm going to do with this photograph is brighten this whole central portion of the image and darken the outside. But I'm also going to give the trees a bit more contrast and definition. If I zoom in here, you'll notice that this central tree here looks somewhat a little bit brighter on one side than the other. Now, there wasn't really any kind of side lighting. I think it's just the shading of the actual bark itself. One side is just darker than the other. I don't think it was any kind of light. Mind you, if you look up here, it could be ambient light coming from the sky. Either way, that's what I'm going to work with. So I'll be doing a lot of dodging and burning again. I'll be dodging the edge of this tree and burning in the sides of these trees to, give the illusion of depth. Now, this tree here, that doesn't have any kind of bright areas or dark areas. It's pretty even right across the board. So I'll be dodging this side quite a bit to also give the illusion that there's a little bit of light hitting this tree, and it'll add depth to the whole image. This side here, I'll probably darken. I probably won't brighten any part of that. The snow here, I really like this curve here. You'll notice that it's slightly darker in here and brighter here, brighter here. I'll be doing some dodging and burning in those areas just to give it a little bit more definition. And if you zoom in onto the snow, there is texture there, but again, because the light is so flat, you just can't see that texture. And of course, as we get to the central area here, there is texture, but it's very hard to see because there's just no light. The other part in the image that was somewhat unavoidable is this branch here. Now, I did try to compose it so that the branch was behind this tree here in the foreground, but every time I move to the right to try and hide it, I'd end up cutting off some of this tree, and I didn't want to cut these trees off because they're the main subject. So I'll probably have to do quite a bit of cloning to get rid of that. And that's probably the main reason why I'm going to be doing most of this image in Photoshop today. If that branch wasn't there, then I would probably just process the whole image in Lightroom. But the cloning tool in Photoshop is a little bit more accurate, and it's a little bit easier to use and get rid of major items such as this. So, but before I put it into Photoshop, I'm just going to do some basic adjustments on this photograph. So we'll just go over to the basic panel here. Now, as far as temperature goes, it was actually quite cool looking today, that day. Now I quite like cool tones, but I'm gonna leave it relatively warm on this one. I mean, I pretty much want to just kind of neutralize the color of the whites. I don't want them too yellow, and I don't want them too blue. So you got to kind of play around with the slider. I mean, that looks pretty good. It looks pretty good when I opened it, actually. Tint, again, I'm just going to put it at 0. Exposure, well, I don't really need to do anything with exposure. I mean, the image is very flat. I'm not clipping any of the highlights or the shadows, so I'm just going to leave that. Contrast, well, we're going to be adding contrast by dodging and burning, but I'm just going to leave that for now. And pretty much all of these sliders, I'm just going to leave at 0. So I don't need to do an awful lot right now with those. Lens correction. Now this was a 16 to 35 millimeter lens, which is an excellent lens, and I don't get really, I don't get any chromatic aberration with this lens, but I'll click that anyway. Enable profile corrections, as I said before. I mean, it doesn't hurt to click it, but in this case, it doesn't really hurt to not click it either, because I'm going to be darkening the edges, vignetting, but I'll just leave it clicked for now. And actually, I just noticed when I zoomed in here, you'll notice that there is a little, I mean, it's minor, but I'll just go back to the basic here and just reduce the highlights or the whites a little bit. There we go. Just get rid of that. Okay, and as far as sharpening goes, let's just zoom in here at 100%. So we'll go to detail. Again, noise reduction, I don't need noise reduction. It's ISO 100. There's no noise in this image whatsoever. Sharpening, again, you're best not to over sharpen it. I mean, you should sharpen it a little bit, but don't overdo it. Again, I'm going to use the same technique as before. Detail right up to 100%, radius 0.5, and I'm just going to slide that up just a little bit. There aren't any really blank areas that you shouldn't be sharpening. The snow, there is a bit of detail in there, but I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to press Option or Alt and hold it down, and then just mask out those areas just a little bit. Okay. All right, so that's a pretty boring, flat image, but I assure you by the time we finish with it, it should look 100 times better. All right, so I'm just going to right click on that and edit in Adobe Photoshop. Okay, I've opened up the image in Photoshop. Okay, now this branch here is going to take a little bit more work, and I don't want to spend half an hour of you watching me clone this out. So I'll just do a couple of little sections here so you get an idea of where I'm taking samples. So the first thing I'm going to do is make the brush a little bit bigger. I'm going to soften it just a tad, and for this bit here, I'm going to take a sample right next to the branch here. So Option, click, and then move over and just start painting over the branch here. I'm going to take another sample up here. So you notice that's slightly darker. So the idea is I'm just going to get rid of everything in here, including this section up here. So I'm going to have to rebuild this tree a little bit and do something back here, and also get rid of this stuff here. Okay, I'm not going to go through the whole thing with you, otherwise you'll be bored to tears. So why don't I just clone all this out, and then we'll get back into the dodging and burning. Okay, now I think I'm done with the cloning. I did a half decent job. This is where the branch was, right here. One thing I should have done before I started cloning was made a duplicate layer, because cloning is quite destructive to the file, and that's something I usually do, but for whatever reason I forgot this time, so I apologize for that. So make a duplicate layer and then do your cloning on top, so if anything goes wrong you can just delete that layer and just start all over again. Right, now on to the fun stuff. Okay, so my first instinct is to draw people, or the viewer, into the background here and towards these trees here. So how do we do that? Well, I'd like to brighten up this as far as possible without blowing out any of the highlights. And there's a number of ways that we can do that, but I think what I'm going to do here is just use a bit of masking with curves. So the way that we do that is, okay, so we open up the curves here. Now you'll notice up in the corner here there's a hand with a couple of little arrows. I'm going to click on that, and if I click on the area that I want to brighten, so I want to brighten up this area here, so I'll hold down my mouse button, and you notice as I drag my mouse up, you also drag up the curves, and the whole image starts to go brighter, which is fine for now, like that. And then we want to make a little bit of contrast in here, so this is the dark area here, and you'll notice as I move my pointer around, it creates these, it shows you where that tone is on the curve. I already made one here. So what I'm going to do here is just drag this down to create more contrast. And you can see already, if you click on the eye here, we've already created quite a bit more contrast to give the image depth. Now if I zoom out, you can see that it's has quite a bit more life in the image. The only problem is that it's affected the whole photograph, and I don't necessarily want to brighten and add contrast to the whole photograph. Especially in here, it's starting to get really, really white, and I don't necessarily want it that white. So we'll just close that for a sec. So what I'm going to do is, if you click on the mask here that's with the layer, and then press Command I or Control I on a PC, that'll invert the mask, and the adjustments are still there. It's just that we've masked them out. And if you press on the Shift key and click on that mask, you can still see the adjustment there. Okay, now what we're going to do is I'm going to get a paintbrush and paint some of those adjustments back into the photograph. So we'll go over to here and pick the paintbrush, or press B for brush, and we're going to use a white paint. So either click on X to change the paint color, or just go over there and physically click it with your mouse. And as far as opacity goes, I think we're going to start off with 30%. So you can go up here and dial in 30, or just press 3 on your keypad. and see how that's changed it to 30. Now, as far as the paintbrush goes, again, if you didn't watch my first video, I don't use a Wacom pad, I use a mouse. So to change the size and the feathering and hardness of the brush, I press Control Option, or I guess that's Control Alt on a PC. And if I slide the mouse to the right and left, it changes the size. If I go up and down, it changes the hardness. So I want it feathered, so I'm going to go down to 0. And then as far as size goes, that should probably do it like that. And then I'm just going to start to paint in the areas where I want to add that adjustment that I made. So this is primarily where I want it, in this area here and in here. So just keep painting over that slowly. Again, you're best not to do everything all at once, but just slowly build up on these things and see the gradual change. And again, if you go too far, all you have to do is press X. So press X, go back to a black paint, and you can go back to your mask and you can reverse what you've just painted in. So if I paint that with a black mask now, it'll just get rid of that effect. Okay, so we'll just keep painting that in. And then if I zoom out and click on the eye here, you can kind of see that we're slowly building up the brightness in the background. Maybe up a little bit in here. Great, that's pretty good. Okay, now what I'm going to do is just going to zoom in again. Now I want to create the illusion that there's a little bit of light hitting this tree, a little bit of this one here, and this one here. I want to create, you'll notice how this tree in the background and this one almost merge into one because of the same tonality. So I want to brighten this tree here in the foreground to create some separation between that one and this one. But first I'm going to start off with these two trees here. So I could either just dodge and burn it, which is not a bad way to do it, or I can repeat what I just did with that first layer. So I'm going to open up a curves layer. Now if you don't have this panel here, you can just go down and pick curves. It's the same thing. So we've got a curves layer. Oops. And I'm just going to zoom in just a little bit. And what I'm going to do here, pick the hand with the arrows. Now I want this to have more contrast, so I'm going to brighten up that section to where I want it. And then this section, I'm going to slowly bring it down to create that contrast again. That looks pretty good. And we'll just click on the mask here. Okay, Command I to invert the mask on a Mac, or Control I on a PC. And B for brush. We're at 30%. We have a white brush. Just going to make the brush a bit smaller here. And I'm going to start painting this in here. And actually we can go up a little higher, we'll go up to 40%. Just zoom out a bit. And you can see that it's brightened up that area considerably, but also added a dark area here. Okay, now on this tree here, I want to also give the illusion that there's a bit of ambient light hitting the side of this to give it more depth. Now in this case, what I'm going to do is just use a bit of dodging. So how do we do that? Well, with the panel here, I can just press on the dodge button here, and that creates the layer for me. Or you can just make your own layer and go up to soft light, and B for brush. Make sure it's on white, and I'm going to start off with just 10%. So 1, press 1 on your keyboard or go up here and put 10%. And what I'm going to do for this is, okay, my brush is quite soft, it's at 0. Now instead of going up and down with the brush, what I'm going to do is just click. I'm going to get close to the edge here and just click it once, and then I'm going to go down to the bottom here, hold down the shift key and then click again, and that'll actually do this whole section in a straight line for me. Now this works great, but you have to be careful that you don't go over, otherwise you'll get a bright edge along the tree here. I'll give you an example here. We'll just go way up to 100% here, and say I'm dodging this edge of the tree here. If I click that there at the top and then hold down the shift key and go too far over the edge, watch what happens. You'll see that it will bleed over into the background, and we don't want that. So what we really want to do is just back off from the edge just a tad, maybe there. And then if I go down here, hold the shift key and click, you'll notice, well, it's still pretty close to the edge. So you have to be really careful with this, and that's why it's good to do it in small sections rather than trying to do it all at once. That's why I always start off at around 10%. So we'll just dial in 10% up here. I click once there, hold down the shift key. We can do that a number of times. So right now I'm just holding down the shift key and going back and forth, up and down. Now you don't want to overdo it. That might be too much, maybe not. Also, the reason why I'm doing it on this side of the tree instead of this side is because we want to draw people into the center of the frame, and we want it to be consistent with the rest of the photograph. So the right side of the tree here is brighter than the left, so we'll keep it the same on this side. Now these trees here, I'll probably just leave dark because, if you think about it, light would be coming in from the side here behind these trees, and it wouldn't really be necessarily hitting the front of these trees here, just the sides of this one and a little bit of that one there. Okay, now that I've done the foreground tree here, I'm going to do the same thing with this tree. I'm going to add a little bit more side lighting and also this second tree behind. So I'm going to use a different layer for each of the trees. So I'll pick a dodge layer again, and we've got a white brush. We're at 10%. Now I'm going to have to make this brush just a little bit smaller here. Something like that might do. So just click on there once, and then hold down the shift key, and voila. Actually, once was probably enough. Like I said, you don't want to overdo it. And I'm going to do the same thing on this one, except I'm going to pick a lower opacity. I'm actually going to go 0.7%. So to do that, you'd press 0.7, or you can just go up there and put 7 in there. And again, I'm just going to click at the top here, top of the tree, and hold down the shift key and click with the mouse. Let's do that a couple more times. That should do it. Let's see. And there we go. There's your light hitting the side of the trees, and that one in the foreground. Okay, now what I'd like to do is just create a little bit more definition between the shadows and the highlights in the foreground here. So again, I'm going to open up another dodge layer, soft light, and I'm still going to use 7% with this one. So I'm going to make the brush just a tad bigger, and I'm going to paint this area in here just slightly and a little bit in this area to create a little bit more depth in this shadowed area. So I just paint that through there. It's going to be so slight that you're probably thinking, oh, it's not doing anything, but it's actually doing more than what you think. So if we go up to that layer now and click on the eye there, you can see how much it's changed the foreground. Just go in there a little bit more. That looks pretty good. Ideally, we want the foreground to be just a little bit darker than the midground, and then finally up here, this is the brightest area in here. So what I can do here is I'm going to create another dodge layer. I'm just going to zoom in a little bit here. B for brush. And I'm just going to dodge this just a little bit in here to create kind of a bit of contrast between the foreground and the midground here. And then just do a little bit more up here. And just zoom out and have a look at that. Yeah, that looks all right. I think I might just do a little bit more in the foreground here. That looks good. Okay, I'm just going to make one more dodge layer here. Soft light. And I'm just going to brighten up the snow on the tree just a little bit. We'll go to 10%, so 1, or just dial in 10. Brush is soft, 0, and we have white. We've picked white. And I'm just going to paint that in. Okay, that looks pretty good. Okay, so now I'm going to do a little bit of burning, so darken some areas in here. So create another layer and go to soft light again, but this time we're going to use black. So it's already on black. X, change black and white, 10%. And what I'd like to do with the black is just darken the edges on this tree and also darken them on this tree here. So I'm going to use the same technique. I'm just going to click once and then hold down the shift key and then just keep going up and down. I'm still holding the shift key and I'm just clicking at both ends. And same with this one. So I clicked on the top, shift key, and you'll note you can see how it's getting darker. And if I check out what I've done, you can see it's quite a bit. Okay, I'm nearly finished with the dodging and burning here. I'm just going to zoom in on this little area here, and I just want to darken this a little bit. So I'm going to create another layer here. Go to soft light. So there it is. B for brush. Make sure it's on black, 10%, and I'm just going to burn this in a little bit. There we go. And if we click on the eye here, we can see how much we've burnt it in. Okay, that'll do. One more thing I'm going to do in Photoshop before I take it into Lightroom again is it's going to go into the levels here, and I do this with all my photographs. I don't know if it's really that necessary. I just have this habit of doing this. I bring the highlights and the shadows up as far as I can before they get blown out. So I just click on this little box here just to make it the histogram a little bit more accurate. And you'll notice that my highlights, I've still got a little bit of wiggle room there before I start losing any highlights. So I'll bring this slider all the way down and it'll brighten up the image. The shadows are fine. Well, maybe I'll bring them up just a tad. So the shadows are darkening a little bit. And then the midtones, I'll go to 1.04. And if I zoom out, oops, I can't zoom out. Hang on there. Okay, we'll just close that. And if I zoom out, you can see that it's added a little bit of contrast and it's brightened it up a little bit. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take all of these layers and make them into a group. So if I hold down the Shift key and click on this bottom layer here, that'll select all of them. And then Command G on a Mac or Control G, and that'll make everything into a group. And if you click on the eye there, you can see everything that I've done to the photograph with the dodging and burning anyway. Okay, now what I'd like to do is I'm going to add a little bit of atmospheric haze in there. And again, this is using the Michael Orton effect. So if you hold down the Shift, Alt, Control key on a PC and then press E, or on a Mac it'd be Shift, Option, Command key, that'll copy everything into one layer. So everything that we've done is now in this layer. Now I'd go up to Filter, Blur, Gaussian Blur. Now a lot of photographers use this effect. There isn't really a right way to do it. This is the way that I do it, and I find it quite effective. I keep the blurriness or the Gaussian blur down to just under 40. And then I'll open up a brightness and contrast layer. Just click on this little box here. So it just affects the blurry layer. And then, let's just move this out of the way here. I'll just jack up the brightness and the contrast. Now we'll just click OK. We'll just close that for a second here. Go down to the layer here and we'll just lower the opacity. And again, usually I go 17% or lower. You don't want to overdo it. Okay, that's pretty good. Now if we click on the brightness and contrast, if you don't like the effect, you can just open it up and just play around with it. I don't want to brighten the image up too much. In actual fact, I'm actually lowering the brightness. Let's see here. Maybe not. Kind of like it right there. Okay, now what I do is make these two items or these two layers into a grouping. So I'll just hold down the Command key and click on that, and then Command G or Control G and make it into a group. Okay, now that I have a group, I'm just going to add a mask to that group. B for brush, and X, turn this into black paint. The opacity I'll make 40%, so press 4. I'm going to alter the brush size, and I'm just going to paint the foreground here because I don't want the effect, the blurriness on the foreground here so much. I'm just trying to affect this central part in the background here. Okay, I think that's pretty good. Okay, now I've pretty much done everything that I wanted to do in Photoshop. Most of this stuff, you know, you could do in Lightroom and it would be just as effective. The only thing that I really wanted to do in Photoshop was to clone out the branch. The cloning tool in Photoshop is quite a bit more effective than Lightroom. If it hadn't been for that, I would have processed this whole image in Lightroom. But there is the radial tool in Lightroom that I do like using more than the gradient radial tool in Photoshop. So I'm just going to save this image and then open it up into Lightroom and just do a couple more things to it before we're finished. Okay, I've opened up the image in Lightroom. First of all, there's a couple of distractions in here. This area here and this area here. Now, rather than try to darken them or clone them out, I'm just going to crop them out because I actually prefer a slightly more 4:5 type aspect ratio. I'd also like to crop a little bit off the bottom here. So I'm just going to go into the crop tool here and bring that up just a tad there and bring this down to, how's that look? That looks pretty good. Okay, now what I'd like to do, I'd like to darken the edges just a little bit more, and there's a number of ways we can do that. We can either use the effects and put some vignetting in there, or a more accurate way and something that has a bit more, has more options, is to use the radial tool here, which I think is what I'm going to use. So I'm just going to zoom out here to 1/16. So we've got lots of real estate around the edge of the image. Pick the radial tool, and I'm just going to draw a circle around this area here, like so, and just feather it just a tad. Now I want to darken the trees around the edge, so I'm just going to adjust the exposure. Now I don't want to darken it too much. So I'm darkening it overall, but I'm trying to open up, keep the shadows reasonably open, if that makes sense. I want this area to be darker than this area here, so that your eye is drawn into the brightest area of the image. Okay, that looks pretty good. Now, that's the nice thing about Lightroom. If you don't like it, you can just adjust it later on or backtrack quite easily. Okay, now I'm going to pick a new radial tool and more or less do the same thing. I'm going to bring this down. I'm just going to brighten up the center portion here, this section here. I don't really want to brighten up this bit up here. Okay, let's brighten it right up and then feather it. Okay, and then just bring the exposure down. That looks pretty good. Okay, now I'm going to use the same kind of technique as I did on the other photograph that I processed. I'm going to use the dehaze. So I'm just adding a little bit of atmospheric kind of fog in there. Bring the exposure down just a little bit. Okay, I think that's just about it. Maybe bring this down just a bit even more. I'm trying to avoid brightening these areas too much because they are a little bit distracting. Okay, and I think that's it. Yeah, it looks pretty good. If you press the F key, you can get a better look at the image with a black background. All right, now I hope you got something out of this. Generally speaking, I don't spend this amount of time on every single image that I take. Like if I was going to work on this image without doing a video on it, it would probably take me maybe 10-15 minutes. Occasionally I'll spend quite a long time on an image if I really think it's worth working on, but most of the time, 5 minutes on an image, sometimes less. It really depends on the light and how much work the photograph needs and what kind of mood I'm in. So I hope you enjoyed this. If you did enjoy it, please be sure to give me a thumbs up. And I just wanted to mention before I sign off here, I do have prints available for sale. I've gone over to a third-party vendor that offers prints, and what I've done is each of the videos that I've been taking, I've been trying to upload the images from those videos onto my website, Quiet Light Photo Adventures. Bit of a mouthful, I know. And if you go into the galleries there, you'll see a gallery for each of the videos, and then you'll see a larger version of each of the images, and there's a button right next to each of the images that says purchase print, and that'll take you to another site where you can buy you know, an 8x12 for I think it's like $20 or $30, something like that. Now, if you are looking for a limited edition print that I print myself, you can find those on my other website, which is adamgibbs.com, and I have hundreds of images on there. Even if you just want to see what kind of photographs I take and what I've been doing for the last 20 odd years, go to that site and you'll see pretty much all of my images. There's just hundreds of them up there. Anyway, either way, please check out my websites and look around, see what you can find. The Quiet Light one, I'm still updating. I'm still working on that one, and actually the other website needs updating. Of course, all these things take time, right? All right, enough of that. Thank you very much again, and I'll see you next time. All right, bye-bye. 'Cause you can reach the sky while I'm stuck here.